We have a story. So we talked about technologies, we talked about dev, we talked about ops, we talked about the orchestration between dev and ops. What we have now is a practitioner, Uber, how they're using DevOps to gain efficiency at Uber. Chandra and Chris, please join me over here. Why don't you guys introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about your story.
Good evening, everyone. So first of all, we should apologize to stand in between your drinks and whatever it is that you're doing at this time, and really appreciate you staying this late. I'm Chandra Ranganathan. I'm responsible for global enterprise infrastructure at Uber.
My name is Chris Duarte. I'm a technical lead manager. I build internal productivity tools.
That's great. Okay, now you have to tell us, what does that mean to all the people over here?
So maybe I should just start with a little bit of how we deal with complexity at Uber. So for us, Uber means scale, it means growth, it means complexity. So if you look at the product itself, we are looking at 65 plus countries, 600 plus cities, 3 million drivers, 75 million riders, 15 million trips a day, and I think we just completed 4 billion trips last year. So that's really what the product has to serve. And then you have the complexity of the enterprise, right? So we have about 500 offices and sites of all sizes, corporate branch, what we call green light hubs. I'll touch upon that a little later. Endpoints, several 100,000 endpoints, and building about 10 offices a month. So that's the kind of complexity that we'll have to deal, and speed as well. And how do we do it? I guess that's where it gets into DevOps. In fact, I have to say I was listening to Nicole talk about CAMs and technology, and we go look through this bullet and go, hey, we do this, right? We're actually going through that every day in how we operate at Uber. Yeah. And we are happy to delve deeper into the processes and what we do with them.
So
DevOps.
When you think of Uber, when you think of services, it's not one service or one application like we used to deliver in the past, right? It's we talked about microservices as things are evolving. We are at Uber. It's a composite of multiple of microservices, and when the scale of number of 4 billion, you said 4 billion rides.
Rides.
Yeah. So if that's the scale we are looking at. What's the scale of your services and the microservices, and how does your software development has kind of changed or evolved as we get into these microservices world?
Yeah, I still remember my first day interview at Uber, and they asked, what do you think of the app? In my head, I'm going, it's a button and a map. I don't know. I think it's pretty easy, right? And then my first day on the job, you find out what we're doing around the world. And I don't know, there was over 600 cities. And in a lot of those cities, we have operation groups that are working on everyday tasks. And it is an amazing operation. And you dive deeper into the services that support every single one of those employees or contractors. And we have 2,000 to 3,000 microservices. These are our in-house built services, as well as some vendor and open source. We are tackling complex problems. Just recently we were posting about how engineers are having to calculate GPS bouncing off a building, so we're creating 3D models and finding more accurate GPS. I don't know if you've tried to pick up your Uber in San Francisco and you might be half a block away. Well, we can't have that, and we fixed that, trying to make transportation as reliable as running water.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add is it's an engineering or tech-driven culture, right? So which is the empowerment is at the engineer and product manager level, and it's really ideas over hierarchy, right? So anyone can come up with ideas and build a product in a matter of days. And then as we get adoption and as it scales, we kind of get into standards, and they get into service catalogs and things like that. One other thing I would want to add is I almost see no distinction between dev and ops when I look at Uber, right? So there are very critical services that are built and run and owned as a service, and it's not. Certainly, it doesn't get handed off to some other team that says it's now yours to own its operations. And in this services-based model, automation is central. So there's so much automation which allows us to run lean and mean as far as all these services are concerned. Typically, we have a tendency to build, but also there's a lot of open source tools that are used. And when that is done, we customize on those tools. And typically we also contribute back to the community, right? Whether it's Chef or any other open source tools. We certainly have some use cases that we can share where DevOps is central to how we run our enterprise, and maybe that I can cover that as part of the next.
Yeah, I think we could do that. But before we get there to use cases, I mean, we talked about Dev, right? With Agile and Dev, the idea is that to release software as fast as possible, right? But at the same time, you cannot afford to have buggy software in production. The velocity of the software delivery is becoming pretty good, right? I mean, very quickly. But how do you deal with the testing part of it? How do you ensure that the software before it goes to production is that you have assessed the risk of deploying in production, and you believe that whatever you're doing has acceptable amount of risk?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to tackle this. In general, when I first got to Uber, I was very surprised that we weren't very test heavy in terms of staging environment. In fact, we went off into prod, but the trick was, shifting left, of course, on testing. Everything's automated in Dev. So every developer owns their services. They own their own outages. So, by encouraging the tests, they're going to get to sleep a little more at night. So I think that's one good incentive is getting some extra sleep.
Yeah, and we also have our own inbuilt productivity tools, whether it's our chat system or whether it's our incident command system. So we actually have channels where outages, for example, if anything goes down or has an impact, it's actually broadcast across all channels, right? So there's an incentive to obviously not want to see your name on that list, but the bigger incentive is to really build it and test it and deploy it in a way that the services are resilient and they don't go down.
Very good. Now, now that we talked about some of the basic things, why don't you share some of the use cases that you have? Because that will be more interesting to the audience over here.
If you don't mind, let me start with infra, and then I'll hand it off to him. He can talk about some cool tools we've built on the productivity side as well. DevOps, and I think someone said it earlier as well, it just doesn't apply to software or applications. I think it really extends across the whole ecosystem, infrastructure as code, right? So that's really how we look at infrastructure. So if I were to drill down into infrastructure a little bit, we have endpoints, several 100,000 endpoints, whether they are mobile devices for Uber Eats or Freight or just the client platforms and laptops and that are used internally. Then you have office builds. So I was talking earlier about having to stand up 10 offices a month, right? And some of these you have to do with literally 2 days notice, and probably in a country that I've not heard the name of, right? So that's another use case. Collaboration. So we have about 3,000 plus conference rooms, and given how Uber is spread out or distributed across different sites, 600 plus sites, collaboration becomes very critical to function. So we use DevOps across all of these areas. The focus is on automation. The focus is on running it lean, mean, and using all of those practices and architecture that was listed, loosely coupled, easy to deploy, continuous testing, release. I'm not going to go into each of those. So we have, for collaboration, AI-driven, voice-based conference rooms, right? So that's something we're looking at. We've come up with something called rapid Wi-Fi and rapid offices. So we can literally office in a box. So we can just take the box, go and set it, connect the circuits, and the office is up and running literally in hours. We're looking to orchestrate and automate a lot of those functions where you have a service catalog. You can go look, and just like you go to Amazon and say, I want compute storage network of this, of this size, you can go pick small, medium, large offices and click a button, and that whole orchestration to set up the office happens. Endpoints, similarly completely orchestrated through DevOps tools where security, provisioning, deployment across mobile and endpoints are all done, and literally the endpoint team that I was talking about earlier is managed by 4 to 5 people, and that's only possible with the whole ecosystem that's completely automated. Do you want to cover some of the tools?
Yeah, I'd love to cover the development side. That's my day-to-day. I feel a lot of pride. You'll walk around the building, and most engineers have 1, 2 giant screens, and one of them is always devoted to my tool, chat. Go fast, rewind to about a year and a half ago, our chat was breaking daily. We were having daily outages, thousands of messages weren't sending, mobile apps weren't there. we came up with the idea, we tried to buy something, it would not work for our scale, our change, our need to communicate across the organization. And so what we had to do is we found a few requirements, and within 3 months we were launched with a new chat solution, and there was no way we would have done that. So we actually had to separate a little bit from the org, build a couple tools, and then push those back into the org to kind of rapidly iterate. And we were pushing, we talk about 10 deploys a day, we're doing 20, 30, 40 days, just constantly deploys. Within the first 3 weeks, we had about 14,000 users on the platform, and we grew to double or triple that after. It's been fast and fun. We're doing the same thing with search now. It's been great.
That's great. We can take some questions over here. It's a small little audience over here, so I think if you guys have questions, we could take questions. And unless you ask them something really, really, confidential, they should be able to answer that. Go ahead, please.
So obviously testing is a vital component to DevOps. So my question is, what processes do you have in place to ensure the validity and robustness of the development team's tests, the unit tests?
Oh, so I could talk a little bit about that. We just finished a Fix-It week where we dedicate time to fixing bugs, and we do organizational-wide statistics on code coverage, failures, time to detection, time to mitigation. So we're actually tracking kind of almost our SLAs to understand if the service is failing in other regards. It's not really enough to say your code coverage isn't there, because there are some products that don't have the code coverage but are reliable. But again, by tracking the failures, we can understand where the trends are and go after that org-wide.
Yeah, and I would also say that the quick release cycles, right, which also enables, it's a fine balance between just having enough release and change management without impacting agility. So you have it's something that develops into an art almost, right? So it's like the balance between delivery and security. It's also the balance between enough release and change management, but deploys are, fast as well, and the agility is not impacted.
Thank you.
How are you shifting left? We touched on some of that earlier. That we used to do. I come from systems management background. All my life I did OpenView, App Dynamics, Oracle Enterprise Manager, but everything my customers always used when things were in production, right?
Right.
Nowadays, there are a lot of people kind of trying to use the same tools in pre-production earlier in the cycle so that they miss out on those. Are you guys doing some of those?
Yeah, for me, in my mind, shift left is even taking on a different perspective, right? So let's talk about running a service through its life cycle. So a service life cycle starts from requirements, architecture, design, deployment, running it in production, and continuous improvement. That's the whole service life cycle. And to me, shift left means taking what an engineer does and moving it to the next level, where almost as an extension of their team, an L2 operations person now is able to do it through automation, through scripts, and then that shifts further into L1 operations or even NOC that can run some of those things where the engineer's time then gets used for high impact initiatives, highly transformative initiatives. You can even shift it further from the NOC to then automated self-healing, right? So that's through AI-based pattern analysis, predictive analysis. So it shifts all the way from engineering to L2 to L1 to NOC to almost automated self-healing, and which is a lot of which we have accomplished. Mm-hmm. So what this does are two things. One is it allows engineers to use their time for really high impact initiatives, but also it allows you to run all of these services very lean and very mean.
You touched on something that is, like a lot of people, when they start shifting left, they don't think about it, but you also need to shift right for certain things, right? It's only shifting left is not good enough, because you have to take some of the things that you're doing and you have to have that's where the collaboration comes into picture. That's where the dev and ops come together, because right. You need to move to the right as well at times.
Exactly.
So, yeah, please.
I want to add something to that. What Chandra says and what you're saying about shifting right is every engineer, every tech person, and even non-tech are really empowered to solve any problems at Uber, and this is not a sales pitch. It's the fact that anyone can solve any problem. We've had whole teams form from simple hackathon projects, right? And so you're enabled to build what you need to solve the problem, and that ownership is great. And then the distribution is actually a little bit of a trouble later on, and so we do start to shift right as things gain adoption and are used more.
That's great. So, talk to us about little, as a lot of these companies are moving and doing digital transformation. You're kind of born digital to some extent, right?
Yep.
Where are you heading? What are the kind of your future focus areas moving forward as you see in like the next 12 to 18 months?
So before we get into the future, I would actually draw upon my prior to Uber experience as well, where I came from a company that had about 75 acquisitions during my time there. So I totally understand the definition of legacy and how I guess workloads tend to get acquired, but not maybe completely integrated.
Right.
And it becomes very difficult to re-engineer legacy workloads. And in fact, in the past, we had built a hybrid cloud and moved a lot of those legacy workloads. In order to move them into a cloud-based environment, they have to re-engineer it. It's not just a lift and shift from a traditional infrastructure into cloud. But coming back to Uber, we didn't have to deal with any sort of such legacy.
Yep.
So we could build ground up, and we could use the latest technologies, microservices, containers, Kubernetes, Mesos. And the other thing is to run it lean and mean in a way it can scale, it can distribute, etc. Our focus, I would say, is now as we scale, as we also look potentially at an IPO, etc., would be more on standards and synergies as it comes to cost. Now, in order to move fast, we've built a lot of microservices. Now it becomes important to synergize and standardize where it's important. And then there's safety and compliance.
Right. I was going to say, one of our biggest things, I can't speak necessarily for the prod application. That, I think a lot of people think about what's next in the future when it comes to the drivers and the riders. But on the corporate side, on the development side, it's really important to think about standing for safety, right? Because we want our riders to feel safe and our drivers to feel safe. That is absolutely the key. But then that filters down to the lowest level services and core services of the company. We have to make sure that our Wi-Fi is always on so that our people can help out the riders and the drivers. And I mean, the value stream is everywhere there.
That's great. So we have a few more minutes. Any questions from customer audience?
I was almost going to say that I know we were running a little late,
Yeah.
and just keeping in the spirit of Uber speed, we were going to get everything back on track.
Yeah, I mean that's always a good idea. Okay, we have a question here. Let's.
I have a question. Like, how big is the software team you're saying, like, have a team, software team? How big is your software team?
Our software team is quite large. It's it just depends exactly how you define it, but just engineering alone is in the many thousands.
Yeah, so the way I would look at it is Uber is still, so we still have decentralized pockets, but we have a tech team tech is typically defined as product engineering and security, right? They all roll up to tech leaders. And I guess we have actually organized into services-based models. So we have, the microservices have owners in terms of services, but as many of them are built by very, very few people, but as they scale and they need to support the entire ecosystem, then the teams get built around it. So that's generally how our teams are structured.
My name is Dicky, and you mentioned something like self-healing. You have experience with that. Could you give us an example of what you did in the self-healing arena?
Yeah, so a very simple example of self-healing in the corporate infrastructure ecosystem, let's say network or generally hybrid cloud, would be to analyze. It's not just to say I'm tracking incidents and I know how many incidents are occurring every day or week, but it's also to understand the pattern of incidents. Is it related to a certain asset? Is it related to a certain geography? What kind of pattern is causing that incident? And going and automating that pattern to not reoccur, right? So you don't get the incident again when you write a script or through automation or AI, you just get ahead of that and preempt that whole incident. So from occurring based on the analysis that you did. And there are several such examples across network or even core infrastructure that we've implemented.
Very good. So come on over here. Let me ask one question to you, and that is, we have entrepreneurs in the room, right? You still have a lot of problems that's not solved where you need help. So if you have to talk to the entrepreneurs in the room on what kind of opportunities that they could really target that the problems that you have that they could solve, health companies like you, high-tech companies who are already kind of born digital and kind of going in the next level of complexity with the microservices and so on?
Sure.
You picked an easy question, right? There are lots of problems, and I always kind of identifying that we get pitched by a lot of vendors. I think I walked around here and was asked to invest in about 18 startup companies, and the main thing is they want to kind of own our data, own our product, and we tend to want to build because we need to own our data, right? So I think when the tools you're building, like you can't assume that you're going to try to take our data. You need to provide the service first and make sure that it's going to be helpful. What are those services? Or anything around software reliability at this point? I mean, that's big for us. And again, like I said, we're moving to a more tested infrastructure, but a lot of times it was more about just always moving forward and fixing our issues, but yeah.
And I would also add that if you look across the DevOps, keeping DevOps as the theme here, across DevOps lifecycle, there's a lot of activities that occur across the software development, DevOps lifecycle, and there's a lot of tools involved in that whole lifecycle. So if you were to go into a certain cloud provider, you actually get integrated tool set, but native to that cloud provider, right? Or same thing, whether it's AWS or Azure. But there's also a lot of companies that use several different such tools that may not necessarily have integration provided as a service. So there are tremendous opportunities in that space.
And compliance, GDPR is coming.
Very good. Last question over here, please.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak at all to DevOps as it relates to ATG, the autonomous group.
Are you in ATG? Is this a planted question or anything?
No, I know someone who's on the team. But,
okay. We kind of prepared for maybe a question like this, and we're unprepared. ATG, was mostly an acquisition and a build of various labs, and they do have some of their own practices, so I can't speak to that.
Yeah, what I would say though is, over time we have standardized a lot of these processes across teams. So when services get built, whether it's through an acquisition or even different teams building different microservices, as we have to adopt and scale them, we have standardized service catalogs that run a certain set of services for functions, and generally common processes, cross-functional processes that are also followed, whether it is for standards, technology, reviews, feedbacks, ratings, things like that for the closed loop. And these are actually followed cross-functionally across the companies. I wouldn't necessarily say ATG has a completely different process from that perspective.
Great, thank you.
Great. So I think that's about it. I think we are on time, and thank you very much for coming here and sharing your story. We'll have all these slides, all the presentation available later on, and you could learn from there. And I guess have a nice evening. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.